A man lost everything to the elves, and when they needed him most, he turned his back on them. But the story you were told about Garithos is a lie. What would you do if you watched your family die before your eyes? If your city was razed while your supposed allies watched from a distance? Garithos isn't the one-dimensional racist villain you remember from Warcraft III. He's something much darker and tragic. Today we're going to discover why this character deserves to be remembered as one of the most brutal and realistic stories in all of Warcraft. And I tell you something, by the end of this video, you're going to understand why Garithos was right, at least from his perspective. But before we start, if you're a Warcraft lore fan and want more videos like this, leave me a like and subscribe. Trust me, what's coming will change the way you see this character forever. But to understand the monster, you first need to know the man, and what the elves did to Garithos is unforgivable. Othma Garithos wasn't born hating elves. In fact, he was a respected lord of Lordaeron, with family, honor, and a bright future. He had lands near Kael'thas, the kingdom of the High Elves. But here comes the first detail nobody tells you. The High Elves of Kael'thas were Alliance allies, but only in name. During the Second War, when the Horde was devastating the north, the elves refused to send more than a handful of rangers. Why? Because they only joined the Alliance when the Horde threatened their territory. The rest of the human kingdoms could burn. They didn't care. And then comes the Third War. Arthas's Scourge ravages Lordaeron like a tsunami of death. Cities fall one by one, and Garithos watches as his family, his lands, everything he loved is destroyed. And you know what? The elves again stood by with their arms crossed. They protected their border while humans died by the thousands. But wait, because here comes what's truly sickening. When the Scourge finally attacked Kael'thas, when the elves desperately needed help, guess who no longer had armies to send? Exactly. The humans were destroyed. Garithos survived. His family didn't. And he knew perfectly well that if the elves had helped earlier, if they had been true allies, his family would be alive. Now think about it from his perspective. You just lost everything. Your kingdom is in ruins. 90% of your people are dead or turned into zombies. And the elves who could have helped you also lost 90% of their population. Poetic justice, karma, or simply the inevitable consequence of selfishness. But Garithos didn't have time to mourn, because someone had to rebuild the Alliance, and that someone would be him. Garithos becomes Grand Marshal of what remains of Lordaeron, not because he was the most powerful or the wisest, but because he was the only one left. The kings were dead. The paladins corrupted or disappeared, the great cities occupied by the Scourge, and Garithos, with his fresh trauma and justified hatred, now led an army of desperate survivors. His mission: retake the capital and reclaim Lordaeron, a suicide mission. And to make matters worse, the Alliance assigns him a group of allies, the same elves who let his family die. And this is where tragedy becomes tyranny. Because what Garithos did to Kael'thas and the Blood Elves has an explanation nobody expected. Pause the video and think about this. You're a military commander. You just survived a genocide. You have limited resources, traumatized men, and an impossible mission. And they assign you a contingent of elves, the same ones who betrayed you before. Would you trust them? Would you give them your best weapons and positions? Because that is exactly what Garithos faced when Kael'thas Sunstrider arrived with his Blood Elves. And here's the crucial detail that Warcraft III doesn't show you clearly. Garithos wasn't being irrationally racist. He was being strategically paranoid, and history would prove him right. In the game, we see Garithos send Kael'thas on suicide missions, take away his troops, and treat him like garbage. And yes, it is cruel. But let's look at the facts. Fact 1. Garithos gives Kael'thas cleanup tasks, secondary missions. Why? Because he literally can't trust that the elves will fight when things get tough. History has taught him that. Fact 2. When Garithos attacks the capital, he needs all his resources, so he takes the troops from Kael'thas and orders him to wait. A logical military decision. Use your best forces for the main objective. Fact 3. And here comes the brutal part. Kael'thas, desperate and without options, makes a pact with the Naga, with Illidan's forces, with the enemies of the Alliance. See the problem? From Garithos' perspective, he just proved his worst fears right. The elves literally betrayed the Alliance again. When Garithos captures Kael'thas, he condemns him to death for treason. And technically, he's right. Kael'thas did make a pact with hostile forces without authorization. In times of war, that is treason. But here's the nuance that makes this story so brutal. Both are right. Both are wrong. Kael'thas had no choice. Garithos had no forgiveness. One was saving his people. The other was protecting what remained of his. And then, when Sylvanas executes Garithos, the story of the most tragically realistic character in Warcraft comes to an end. But wait, because the real question isn't whether Garithos was a villain. The real question is, what does this character tell us about Warcraft that Blizzard never wanted to admit? Garithos is uncomfortable, and he's uncomfortable because he's real. In a universe full of noble heroes and cosmic villains, Garithos is a man broken by trauma who makes terrible decisions based on real experiences. He's not possessed by a demon. He wasn't corrupted by dark magic. He simply watched his people die, blamed those who could have helped and didn't, and let that pain turn into hatred. And here comes what's uncomfortable. Blizzard presents him as a one-dimensional villain because the alternative is too complicated. Because if you admit that Garithos has valid reasons for his hatred, then you have to admit that the elves share the blame, that the Alliance wasn't perfect, that victims can become victimizers, and that doesn't fit the good versus evil narrative that Warcraft needed at that time. Garithos is simply a traumatized survivor who couldn't overcome his pain, and that makes him more real than all the others. Because we all know someone like that. Someone who suffered something terrible and could never let it go. Someone who let pain define who they are. And that's terrifyingly human. So, was Garithos wrong? Yes. Absolutely. Was he a racist? Yes. His hatred was generalized and unfair. Was he unnecessarily cruel? Without a doubt. But, was it understandable? Can you see how he got to that point? And that's the question Warcraft asks you but never answers. To what extent does trauma justify our actions? When does a victim stop being a victim and become a perpetrator? Garithos crossed that line, but unlike other Warcraft villains, he crossed it walking, not jumping. He crossed it step by step, decision by decision, each one logical in its own twisted context. And that makes him the most misunderstood villain in all of Warcraft. Because you don't need to understand him to hate him. But if you understand him, you can't hate him completely. Garithos' story is the story of how unhealed pain can poison everything you touch. It's a warning about the price of justified hatred. Because even when you have real reasons for your anger, even when terrible harm has been done to you, in the end, hatred only destroys you and those around you. Garithos died hated, alone, betrayed by those he should never have trusted. But in a way, he had already died years before, when he chose to let his trauma define his future instead of his humanity. And that's the true tragedy. Not that he was a villain, but that he could have been a hero. If this video changed your perspective on Garithos or on Warcraft lore, leave me a like and subscribe because I have more deep analyses of misunderstood characters coming. And now tell me in the comments, was Garithos a villain or a victim? Are his actions justified or unforgivable? I want to read your opinion, and if you want me to analyze another Warcraft character with this depth, let me know. See you in the next video.